What if I told you that at the very top of Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town, you weren't supposed to face your rival, but something else? Something far more horrifying. A rotting figure, hungry for you and your Pokémon. This is the legend of the Buried Alive model, Pokémon's darkest creepypasta. Lavender Town was already infamous, a place built around death, filled with ghosts and remembered for music that never sat right. The legend took those fears further. It imagined a hidden boss fight in Red and Blue, one buried deep where no players were never meant to find. A final boss, a rotting corpse, desperate to claw its way out of the ground, known only as Buried Alive. But here's the part that keeps people hooked. We'll trace how it spread, the artwork that made it feel real, and the details that convinced players that it might exist. But how much of it actually did exist? Well, let's find out. The legend surrounding this hidden encounter quickly became known as the Buried Alive model. In some posts, it was even referred to by a coding label, the Berryman script. The creepypasta claims this grotesque character was meant to appear at the very top of Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town, replacing the battle with the restless Marowak spirit. Instead of a grieving Pokemon's ghost, you'd face something out of a horror game, presented as the tower's final boss within the story. Of course, Lavender Town was already remembered as unsettling. The muted NPCs, the ghost sprites, the off-key music. That existing atmosphere is precisely what made the rumor feel possible. Because if anywhere in Red and Blue could hide a secret boss, fans agreed it had to be here. Online posts from the early 2010s cemented this idea. From there, the Buried Alive model wasn't just a rumor, it became part of the folklore surrounding Pokemon's darker side. So, according to these circulated scripts, Buried Alive wasn't described as a ghost trainer or a mysterious spirit. He was said to be a corpse, rotting and half buried, clawing at the dirt. When a player reached the top floor in the story's version, the screen would fade out to black, linger for a moment, then display text meant to send a chill straight through the player. It said,
"You're here. I'm trapped. And I'm lonely. So very lonely. Won't you join me?"
Lines like these, written with desperate pauses, gave the encounter a tone of pleading isolation. Unlike any other trainer dialogue, Buried Alive wasn't taunting or confident. He sounded broken, almost begging for the player to stay. That tone helped sell the idea that this wasn't just a battle, it was a fatal mistake you'd stumbled into. From there, the fight began, and the creepypasta pulled no punches in its description. Buried Alive's in-game sprite was described as half decayed, eyes sunken, mouth curled into a distorted grin. And his team? Well, that was a Gengar, a Muck, and then 2 white hands. That's right, 2 white hands, not Pokemon according to the creepypasta. Severed hands, crawling, twitching, dragging themselves into battle. The story described rotting flesh, clinging to twisted fingers, digits that flexed as if reaching for you through the screen. Unlike ordinary opponents with defined sprites and animations, these creatures sounded monster-like, primal and grotesque. For players reading the story online, the white hands were the moment it crossed from chilling into nightmare fuel. Fans imagined them inching forward in each frame, not fainting when defeated, but being pulled down like corpses attempting to rise. On forums and comment threads from that time, readers described how simple but visual the outline was. You could picture the scene even without ever seeing it on the cartridge. The creepypasta leaned into that contrast. Regular Pokemon battles felt predictable. Fainting, text boxes, the same series of commands. Buried Alive's fight was presented as different from the moment it began. The descriptions made the music sound warped or distorted, the text was uneasy, and the team itself, half in canon, half nightmare nonsense, made it feel like you'd stumbled into something that never should have been left in the game. The other feature that stuck in people's minds wasn't just the design, it was what the rumor claimed happened next. This battle wasn't supposed to end like any other, it was meant to leave a lasting mark you couldn't escape. And that's where the story turns even darker, because according to the legend, losing to Buried Alive wasn't like losing to any trainer you'd faced before. So what happens in the story when Buried Alive defeats you? Well, that's where the creepypasta leaned hardest on fear. Normally, Pokemon has a soft landing, your team faints, you black out, the screen fades, and you're safely back at the Pokemon Center. Nothing permanent is lost, but here, defeat meant something else entirely, something final. According to the creepypasta, if you tried to win, the game froze. Scripts supposedly had no instructions for victory. It was unwinnable by design. But if you lost, the text box showed Buried Alive leaning forward with a line players never forgot.
Finally, raw meat.
The ending didn't stop with an ordinary game over. The story described a unique sequence, a faint background image of Buried Alive crouched over your fallen body, devouring the player character. That visual, combined with the corruption effect, convinced readers they'd stumbled into something far more sinister than a typical lost condition. The creepypasta, of course, pushed things even further with a second claim. And that claim was that the defeat sequence rewrote your cartridge. Supposedly, once Buried Alive consumed your character, a hidden routine copied that grotesque image into the Game Boy's internal memory. From then on, every time you switched the system on, the title screen would never load. Instead, it showed the decaying corpse gnawing on your character while a distorted audio file played, one referred to as static mesh.wave. The idea of the game rewriting itself was what made the rumor unforgettable. Kids imagined this wasn't just disturbing in-game content, it actually infected the cartridge, permanently altering the single most precious game they owned. For children of the late 90s who clutched their game cartridges like treasures, the thought of it being ruined was almost worse than the monster itself. But here's where reality cuts back in. On original hardware, a Game Boy cartridge couldn't overwrite the startup screen. The title routine wasn't inside the cartridge, it was burned into the system itself. Game cartridges could store saves and assets, yes, but they couldn't change how the Game Boy booted. And while the internet posts described a file called staticmesh.wave as if hidden in the ROM, no emulator, no data mine, and no research ever revealed anything like it. That supposed file, well, it simply wasn't there. Still, plausibility wasn't the point. What mattered was that the claim felt possible. Older games did crash, and saves could vanish. Everyone knew the gut punch of powering on a Game Boy one day only to find every hour erased by a dead battery. So the Buried Alive myth exploited that anxiety, linking a believable real-life fear with a grotesque finale. Even the smallest touches added weight. Instead of cheerful restart music, the descriptions mentioned strange garbled tones like static buzz from a speaker pushed too far. Readers swore that they could imagine that kind of noise, harsh and out of place, streaking through the Game Boy's cheerfully simple sound chip. The legend gave the impression of a haunted system, as if the game itself wanted you gone. And that's why the story became a lasting part of Pokemon folklore, not just because of Buried Alive's design, but because it twisted the safest part of the series, which was the guarantee of another try. It turned it into a punishment worse than losing. It was a myth of corrupted screens, ruined saves, and a cartridge that wouldn't ever feel safe again. And when players began digging to prove it, the legend faced its biggest challenge yet. If any of this were real, why had no trace ever been found? That puzzle led fans to confront what became known as the missing evidence problem. For all of the vivid details, sprites, and supposed dialogue floating around online, not a single confirmed copy of Pokémon Red or Blue has ever contained traces of Buried Alive. Enthusiasts dug into the ROMs through the 2000s and 2010s, unpacking sprite sheets, cross-checking regional versions, even combing through unused trainer classes and debugging leftovers. Some claim to discover discover a Barryman sprite buried in scrambled data, but none of those finds were consistent between dumps, and none matched the recognizable fan art people had seen circulating. Today, the verdict from those who have actually examined the code is clear. There is no buried alive fight, no white hand asset, and no overwritten routine hidden in these game cartridges. So where did this imagery come from? Well, much of it began with the fan community itself. One of the earliest and most shared sources was the work of the artist Queen Kami, who created unsettling sprites of both Buried Alive and the infamous White Hand around 2010. These were always labelled as fan-made, but once reposted without context, well, the disclaimers vanished. On a forum or in a blurry screen cap, the pixel work looked close enough to the official assets that casual players mistook them for something ripped straight out of the game. The timeline of the story's spread helps examine how these images gained so much traction. Versions of the Buried Alive scenario were already circulating on Tumblr by July 2010. In 2011, a formalized entry appeared on the Creepypasta Wiki presenting the Barryman script as if it came directly from leftover trainer data. Then in 2012, a YouTube video uploaded by the account 7G06 stitched together mock-up screenshots and audio, adding yet another layer of supposed proof. Each platform reinforced the others. A sprite on Tumblr gave weight to a description on the wiki, which in turn was validated by a horror video circulating on YouTube. That cycle of repetition made the story feel documented rather than invented. One of the reasons Buried Alive stood out compared to other creepypastas was, well, its writing style. The tale read less like horror fiction and more like a set of patch notes or debug documentation, including file names, scripted battle dialogue, and supposed memory routines. For kids who were used to digging through cheat code magazines or reading about glitch Pokémon, that structure looked convincing. It felt less like a creative short story and more like leaked internal notes from Game Freak itself. This blending of formats is what created confusion. On one hand, forum posts claimed that text strings called the Barryman script came directly from an early build of the game. On the other, fan artwork and videos circulated as visual confirmation. The problem was that each piece of evidence was manufactured outside the codebase, and when fans finally lined up the actual red and blue assets, the clean sprite sheet showed no trace of what the legend described. And yet, the myth kept sticking. Even as ROM hackers searched the program line by line, players still remembered the screenshots, the eerie dialogue snippets, and the fan sprites burned into their brains. The lack of technical proof simply didn't matter to many readers because the story tapped into something deeper than evidence. It spoke to the way we wanted to believe there was still secrets hiding inside a game we thought we knew by heart. That dissonance between what was proven false and what felt true explains why Buried Alive refused to fade away. With every repost and every new proof, the line between fiction and possibility blurred just enough to survive. And that brings us to the real puzzle. If no one doubts its absence from the actual game data today, why has Buried Alive managed to remain the most famous piece of Pokémon horror almost 20 years later? The reason Buried Alive still circulates isn't hidden in game code, it's the way memory, fear, and community keep the legend alive. What players carried with them wasn't evidence, but the feeling the story captured. It played perfectly on a mix of nostalgia and unease that Pokémon fans already shared. Creepypastas were designed to take something familiar and tilt it just enough to unsettle. Lavender Town provided a natural foundation. The crackling minor key music sounded eerie even in childhood. The Pokémon Tower was a cemetery dropped into a children's adventure, and the Cubone story about a young creature mourning its mother, well, that introduced concepts of grief and death that stuck with players. So, when a rumor suggested an even darker figure hiding at the top of this tower, well, it didn't feel out of place. It felt like a natural extension of what kids already sensed inside the game. By the late 90s, Pokémon had primed its community to expect hidden secrets. Kids whispered about a Mew trapped under a truck by the SS Anne, or about Professor Oak becoming a secret boss. And unlike most rumors, missing though, well, that was real, a glitch that scrambled the Hall of Fame screen and could duplicate items. Well, this convinced kids the games contained strange, unexplored corners. So when you think about it, it isn't surprising that when Buried Alive surfaced, people treated it as something possible. The culture around Pokémon made darker legends feel believable, and the community itself kept it breathing. ROM hackers created playable battle encounters, slotting in custom sprites to simulate the fight. On YouTube, players shared mock Let's Plays where Buried Alive appeared with its white hands, ending the freeze screen death sequence described in the story. These weren't just jokes, they were staged to look like actual captures of lost content, giving millions of viewers the impression of evidence. Later on, appearances in mods or indie creations ensured the image never disappeared. Horror projects used distorted Lavender Town themes to invoke the same sense of unease. Fan crossovers brought Buried Alive into rhythm games or spliced his sprite into new Pokémon hacks. Every adaptation acted like another proof point. If you saw Buried Alive referenced in one corner of gaming culture, it seemed to validate whatever you had read about him before. And what made it stick long term was that emotional core. Childhood games were safe spaces, little game cartridges you carried in a pocket that always welcomed you back when you lost. When a story suggested that the cartridge itself could betray you, corrupting your save or even your own startup screen, well, it hit different. It wasn't just horror, it was a violation of trust. When your childhood safe space became the site of permanent damage in a story, it hurt more than a normal horror beat. The spread followed a simple rhythm. It felt like something possible, fans illustrated it, those images and videos looked authentic, and their circulation seeded new retellings. Rinse, repeat. Mythology took shape. Even as debunks stacked up, what mattered was the cycle of retelling, each iteration keeping it current for a new audience. In the end, Buried Alive endured not because it was real, but because it harmonized with how Pokémon players already imagined their world. Rumors, secrets, hidden codes, and maybe something terrifying just out of sight. What started as a single fan-made post grew into a full cultural ghost story, retold so often that its lack of evidence became irrelevant. And when you step back, that's the most telling part. It shows how myths don't need truth to last. They only need to connect deeply enough to memory and fear to feel like they belong. Now, if Buried Alive made you uneasy, just wait until you see how many times Ash has actually died in the Pokémon anime. Because trust me, it's more times than you think. If you want to see every one of his deaths, from drowning to freezing or being turned to stone, well, click right here and I'll see you over there. Take care.